The crystalline city of Zalora sparkled like a jewel under the twin suns, its towering spires reflecting light in dazzling patterns across the sky. It was a place of beauty and power, home to the Valith, a species known for their shimmering silver skin, telepathic abilities, and unshakable belief in their own superiority. At the heart of this glittering empire stood Princess Lysara, the youngest heir to the throne and the pride of her people. From birth, she had been told that she was destined for greatness, that her kind were the pinnacle of evolution. And Lysara believed it wholeheartedly. Today, as always, she sat atop her gilded chair in the Grand Council chamber, her posture perfect, her expression cold. Before her stood representatives from various planets, each vying for trade agreements or alliances with Zalora. Most cowered under her piercing gaze, intimidated by her sharp words and even sharper mind. But there was one who did not, Cal Draven, a human mechanic turned diplomatic liaison sent by Earth. Cal was unlike anyone Lysara had ever encountered. His clothes were plain, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, and his demeanor lacked the deference she expected. While others bowed deeply before speaking, Cal merely inclined his head slightly, meeting her eyes without flinching. When she dismissed Earth's proposal for an energy-sharing program with a sneer, calling humans primitive carbon filth, he didn't shrink back. Instead, he smiled faintly and replied, "Perhaps we're primitive, Your Highness, but at least we don't need shiny rocks to feel superior." A murmur rippled through the room. No one dared speak to Lysara like that. She narrowed her eyes, leaning forward slightly. "Do you have something to prove, human?" "Only that your arrogance blinds you," Kale said calmly. "Earth has resources and technology you'd benefit from. But if you're too busy looking down on us, maybe we'll take our business elsewhere." Lysara bristled, her cheeks flushing faintly, not out of embarrassment, but anger. How dare this insignificant creature challenge her? Yet, despite her irritation, she couldn't deny that his words intrigued her. There was a confidence in him, a quiet strength that made her curious. Who was he, really? Why wasn't he afraid of her? Over the next few days, Kel continued to defy her expectations. During negotiations, he countered her every insult with wit and logic, earning nods of approval from other delegates. Even some Valith counselors began to listen more closely to what he had to say. Each time he spoke, Lysara felt her grip on the situation slipping just a little more. It infuriated her, but also fascinated her. One evening, after another tense meeting, Lysara found herself staring out at the stars from her private balcony. Her thoughts kept returning to Kale. He was rude, disrespectful, and entirely too bold. Yet there was something about him that refused to leave her mind. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, not with fear or admiration, but as though he saw straight through her facade. For the first time in her life, Lysara felt uncertain. Was she truly as superior as she believed? Or was Cal right? Could her arrogance be blinding her to opportunities and truths she hadn't considered? Little did she know, these questions would soon lead her down a path that would change everything. The aftermath of the rebellion brought an uneasy calm to Zalora. The once opulent palace, now scared by battle, stood as a symbol of both destruction and renewal. Lysara, no longer the arrogant princess who had dismissed others with disdain, ascended the throne not out of entitlement, but through the trust and respect she had earned. Her coronation was unlike any other in Valith history, attended not just by nobles, but by rebels, workers, and even representatives from Earth. As she addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carried a quiet strength that resonated deeply. "For too long, our people have been divided by fear and arrogance," she began, her silver eyes scanning the room. "But today marks a new beginning, a chance to build a future where everyone, regardless of status or origin, has a voice." Her words were met with cheers, though some among the old guard shifted uncomfortably. Change would not come easily, but Lysara was determined to see it through. She announced sweeping reforms, equal rights for all citizens, improved living conditions in the lower levels, and open trade agreements with Earth. Kale stood nearby, his presence steady and supportive, watching as Lysera transformed into the leader he'd always believed she could become. In private moments, their bond deepened. One evening, as they walked along the palace gardens bathed in twilight, Kale spoke softly. "You've changed so much since we first met. I'm proud of you." Lysera smiled faintly, glancing at him. "And I wouldn't have made it this far without you. You taught me things I never thought I needed to learn." Kale chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't teach you anything. You already had the strength inside you. I just reminded you where to look." She stopped walking, turning to face him. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. Then, hesitantly, Lysera reached for his hand. "Stay with me," she said quietly. "Not as an advisor or liaison, but as something more." Kale's expression softened, surprise giving way to warmth. "Are you sure? It won't be easy. People will talk." "I don't care what they say," Lysera replied firmly. "What matters is what we believe, and I believe we're stronger together." He squeezed her hand gently, a small smile playing on his lips. "Then I'm yours, if you'll have me." Their relationship defied tradition, sparking whispers among the Vailith elite. But Lysera refused to let societal expectations dictate her life. Together, she and Kale became a beacon of unity, a human and a Vailith proving that love and cooperation could transcend boundaries. Under Lysera's rule, Zalora flourished. The lower levels saw improvements in infrastructure and education, while alliances with Earth brought technological advancements that benefited both species. Rebels who had fought alongside her were given positions of influence, ensuring diverse voices shaped the Empire's future. Even skeptics couldn't deny the positive changes sweeping across the galaxy. One night, as Lysera and Kale stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city, now brighter and more vibrant than ever, Lysera leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we can really make this work?" she asked quietly. "We already are," Kale replied, wrapping an arm around her. "This isn't just your victory, it's ours. And there's still so much more we can do." Together, they gazed up at the stars, dreaming of a future where differences weren't barriers but bridges. Lysera had started this journey as a princess blind to her own flaws. She ended it as a leader humbled by growth and driven by compassion. And though challenges lay ahead, she faced them with unwavering resolve, because she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in her life, Lysera understood that true greatness wasn't about looking down on others. It was about lifting them up and standing beside them as equals. The rebels' plan was set. Armed with a data chip containing evidence of Lord Valen's conspiracy, Lysera and Kale prepared to infiltrate the palace under cover of darkness. It was a risky move. Valen's forces were everywhere, and one wrong step could mean capture or worse. But they had no choice. If they didn't act now, Valen would solidify his power, and any hope of restoring justice to Zalora would vanish forever. As they approached the palace gates, Lysera felt a strange mix of fear and determination. This place had once been her home, a symbol of her privilege and authority. Now it loomed before her like a fortress of lies, its glittering spires mocking her naivety. She glanced at Kull, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We've got this," he whispered. Inside, the corridors were eerily quiet, patrolled by Valen's soldiers. Using stealth tactics taught to her by the rebels, Lysera moved silently, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time, she relied not on her powers or status, but on her wits and resolve. Every shadow became an ally, every sound a potential threat. When they finally reached the council chamber, they found Valen waiting for them. He stood near the throne, his expression smug as though he'd anticipated their arrival. "Ah, Princess Lysera," he drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. "I see you've returned from your little adventure." Lysera stepped forward, clutching the data chip tightly. "Your schemes end here, Valen. I have proof of your treachery." Valen laughed coldly. "Proof? Do you really think anyone will believe you over me? You're nothing but a spoiled child playing dress-up as a leader. Kale stepped beside her, his tone sharp. That's where you're wrong. The people already know the truth. They've seen what kind of ruler you are. Greedy, cowardly, and weak. Enraged, Valen signaled his guards, who surrounded them. Outnumbered and cornered, Lysera felt a surge of panic, but then something inside her shifted. She thought of all the lessons she'd learned in the lower levels, the courage of the rebels who had stood by her side, and the unwavering support of Kale. Summoning every ounce of strength, she raised her voice. You think power comes from control, Valen, but you're wrong. True power comes from unity, from lifting others up instead of tearing them down. And that's why you'll never win. Her words echoed through the chamber, catching the attention of nearby servants and counselors who began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Seizing the moment, Kale activated a holographic display using the data chip, projecting indisputable evidence of Valen's betrayal onto the walls. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth unfolded before their eyes. Valen's face twisted in fury. This changes nothing, he snarled, lunging toward Lysera. But Lysera was ready. With quick thinking, she dodged his attack and grabbed a ceremonial staff leaning against the throne. Turning it into an improvised weapon, she struck him squarely in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. Breathing heavily, she turned to face the stunned onlookers. Her voice rang out clear and strong. Valen sought to divide us, to rule through fear and greed. But together, we can build a better future, one where everyone has a voice, not just the powerful few. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and even some of Valen's own guards lowered their weapons, unwilling to fight for a lost cause. As Valen was dragged away, Lysera felt a wave of relief and pride. She had faced her fears, confronted her flaws, and emerged stronger than ever. Later that night, as she and Kale stood alone on the palace balcony overlooking Zulora, she turned to him with gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me when no one else did." Kale smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You did the hard part, Lysera. All I did was remind you of who you could be." And in that moment, surrounded by stars and newfound hope, Lysera realized she wasn't just fighting for Zulora anymore. She was fighting for something far greater, a world where differences united rather than divided, and love transcended boundaries. The next morning, Lysera found herself standing at the edge of Zulora's lower levels, a part of the city she had never visited before. The air here was thick with the scent of grease and smoke, a stark contrast to the pristine corridors of her palace. Above her, the towering spires of the upper city glittered like distant stars. But down here, everything was grimy and chaotic. Streets teemed with beings from all corners of the galaxy, outcasts, laborers, and traders who eked out a living far from the polished world she knew. Kale stood beside her, arms crossed as he surveyed the scene. "Welcome to the real Zulora," he said dryly. "No servants, no guards, and definitely no powers allowed." Lysera wrinkled her nose in distaste. "This place is repulsive. Repulsive or not, it's where you'll be staying for the next week," Kale replied, unfazed by her disdain. "Let's see how long that perfect princess act holds up without your fancy title to back it up." Her cheeks flushed with indignation, but she held her tongue. She had accepted his challenge after all, and there was no way she'd let him win. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped forward into the crowded streets, determined to prove him wrong. The first task was simple enough, or so she thought. Kale handed her a small pouch of credits and instructed her to buy food for their midday meal. Confident in her abilities, Lysera approached a vendor selling steaming bowls of stew. But when she tried to negotiate the price, the vendor laughed in her face. "You're terrible at this," he said gruffly. "Go find someone else to waste my time." Humiliated, Lysera stormed back to Kale, who was watching with an amused smirk. "What did I do wrong?" she demanded. "You didn't respect him," Kale explained patiently. Down here, people don't care about titles or status. You have to earn their trust. Reluctantly, Lysera returned to the vendor, forcing herself to speak more politely. After several awkward attempts, she finally managed to purchase 2 bowls of stew, at twice the price she should have paid. Still, Kale nodded approvingly. Not bad for a start. Over the next few days, Lysera struggled through one humbling experience after another. She tripped over crates while trying to carry supplies, burned her fingers attempting to cook over an open flame, and accidentally offended a group of workers by refusing their offer of help. Each failure chipped away at her pride, leaving her frustrated but oddly intrigued. For the first time, she began to notice things she'd always ignored. The camaraderie among the workers, the creativity they used to solve problems, the quiet strength in their resilience. One evening, as they sat on a rooftop overlooking the bustling streets below, Lysera sighed heavily. "I had no idea life could be like this," she admitted quietly. Kale glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Most people don't get to see this side of Zalora. They think it's dirty and worthless, but there's beauty here if you look closely enough." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lysera turned to him, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light of the stars above. "Do you think I'll ever understand it? Truly understand it?" Kale smiled faintly. "Maybe, but only if you stop looking down and start seeing what's right in front of you." As the night wore on, Lysera felt something shift inside her, a crack in the armor of arrogance she had worn for so long. She still had much to learn, but for the first time, she was willing to try. And perhaps, just perhaps, Kale wasn't such a nuisance after all. Lysera and Kale found temporary sanctuary in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the lower levels. The building was old and crumbling, its walls covered in graffiti from countless rebels who had sought refuge there before them. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter and time to think. As they caught their breath, Lysera's mind raced with questions. Who could she trust? Was anyone in the palace loyal to her, or had they all turned against her? She clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "They betrayed me," she muttered bitterly. "My own people." Kale placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "Not everyone," he said firmly. "There are still good people out there, people who believe in fairness and justice. You just have to find them." He explained that the lower levels were home to more than just outcasts. They were also a haven for those who opposed the oppressive rule of the Vailith elite. Among them were former soldiers, engineers, and even some disillusioned nobles who had grown tired of corruption. If Lysera could rally these individuals, she might stand a chance against Lord Valen and his conspirators. The next morning, Kale led Lysera to a hidden meeting spot, a dimly lit basement where a group of rebels gathered nightly. At first, the room fell silent as the others noticed the princess standing beside him. Many glared at her, their distrust evident. One man stepped forward, his arms crossed. "What's she doing here?" he growled. "She's here because she wants to change things," Cal replied, his voice steady. "She's not the same person she used to be." Lysera swallowed hard, stepping into the light. Her silver skin gleamed faintly, but her expression was one of humility rather than arrogance. "I know you have no reason to trust me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "For years, I looked down on you, all of you, but now I see how wrong I was. I've learned what it means to struggle, to fight for something bigger than myself, and if you'll let me, I want to help." The room remained quiet for a moment, tension thick in the air. Then, a young woman with patched-up armor spoke up. "Prove it," she said simply. "Show us you're serious." Over the next few days, Lysera threw herself into the rebels' work. She helped repair broken equipment, distributed supplies to families in need, and listened intently as Kel taught her strategies for organizing resistance efforts. Each task was humbling, each interaction a reminder of how much she still had to learn. Yet, slowly but surely, the rebels began to accept her, not as a princess, but as someone willing to earn their respect. One evening, as they sat around a flickering fire, Kale handed Lysera a small device. "This is a data chip containing evidence of Valen's conspiracy," he explained. "We intercepted it during our escape. It proves he's been plotting against you and planning to frame Earth." Lysera stared at the chip, her heart pounding. "If we can get this to the Council—" "We will," Kale interrupted, his tone resolute. "But we'll need more than evidence. We'll need strength, unity, and courage." As their eyes met across the flames, Lysera felt something she hadn't expected: hope. For so long, she had relied on her title and powers to command respect. Now, stripped of both, she realized true strength came from connection, from standing shoulder to shoulder with others, no matter how different they seemed. And for the first time, she understood why Kale fought so fiercely for his beliefs. He wasn't just fighting for Earth. He was fighting for a better future for everyone. Little did they know, their newfound bond would soon be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. The battle ahead would demand everything they had, and perhaps even more. The palace was alive with chaos as Lysera and Kale led the charge to reclaim control. Valen's arrest had ignited a firestorm within the upper city, his loyalists rallying to defend their crumbling power. Armed guards flooded the corridors, their weapons trained on anyone who dared oppose them. But Lysera and Kale weren't alone. They had the rebels by their side, ordinary beings from the lower levels who refused to be silenced any longer. "Stick close," Kale instructed, his voice low but firm, as they moved through the shadows. "We take out their leaders first. Without direction, they'll crumble." Lysera nodded, gripping her makeshift staff tightly. She had come so far since her days of arrogance and entitlement, trading gilded halls for battlefields, and learning that true strength came not from fear, but from unity. Each step forward felt like a testament to how much she'd grown, and how much she still had to fight for. Their first target was the war room, where Valen's top commanders were coordinating their defense. With precise timing, the rebels launched a diversionary attack on the eastern wing, drawing most of the guards away. Taking advantage of the confusion, Lysera and Kale slipped into the war room unnoticed. Inside, 3 high-ranking officers huddled over a holographic map, barking orders into communicators. Before they could react, Lysera stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your rebellion ends here." One of the officers sneered, reaching for his weapon. "You think you can stop us, little princess?" Before he could act, Kale disarmed him with swift precision, while Lysera used her staff to knock another officer off balance. The third tried to flee, only to be intercepted by a group of rebels storming in behind them. Within moments, the commanders were subdued, their plans scattered across the floor. But the victory was short-lived. Alarms blared throughout the palace as reinforcements closed in, forcing Lysera and her allies to retreat deeper into the labyrinthine structure. They fought their way through narrow hallways and grand chambers, each skirmish testing their resolve. At one point, Lysera found herself face to face with a guard twice her size. Fear flickered in her chest, but she pushed it aside, remembering Cal's words. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Summoning every ounce of determination, she struck the guard with her staff, sending him sprawling to the ground. Kale watched her with admiration, realizing just how far she'd come. "Not bad for a princess," he teased between breaths. She smirked faintly, though her focus remained sharp. "Don't get used to it." Finally, they reached the throne room, the heart of Zalora's power. There, standing defiantly before the golden days, was Lord Valen himself. His expression was wild, his eyes burning with desperation. "You may have my men, but you'll never take my throne," he shouted, raising a plasma blade. Kale moved to confront him, but Lysera held up a hand. "This is my fight," she said firmly. For a moment, Valen hesitated, surprised by her boldness. Then, with a roar, he charged at her. Their clash was fierce, steel meeting staff in a flurry of sparks and shouts. Though Valen was stronger, Lysera's agility and newfound resilience gave her the edge. Dodging his blows, she countered with calculated strikes, until, finally, she knocked the blade from his hand. Breathing heavily, she pointed her staff at him. "It's over, Valen." Defeated, he collapsed to his knees as guards swarmed in to arrest him. As silence fell over the throne room, Lysera turned to see Kale and the rebels watching her with pride. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like part of something greater. Together, they had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. And though the road ahead would be long, Lysera knew one thing for certain. Change had begun. By the fourth day in the lower levels, Lysera was beginning to adapt, slowly but surely. She had learned to barter without embarrassing herself, carry supplies without dropping them, and even cook meals that weren't completely inedible. Cal watched her transformation with a mix of pride and amusement, though he rarely let it show. Their bickering had softened into playful banter, and there were moments when their laughter felt almost natural. But not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Back in the upper city, whispers of rebellion stirred among the Valeth elite. Lord Valen, one of the most powerful counselors, saw Lysera's absence from the palace as an opportunity. He despised her growing leniency toward lesser beings and feared she would weaken Zalora's dominance if allowed to rule. To him, her disappearance was a gift, a chance to seize power and restore what he believed to be the true order. Valen sent his agents into the lower levels, ordering them to capture Lysera and frame Kale for her abduction. The plan was simple: make it look like the human ambassador had kidnapped the princess out of spite, then use the incident to justify severing ties with Earth and tightening control over Zalora. Late one evening, as Lysera and Kale prepared to return to their makeshift shelter, a group of armed men cornered them in a narrow alley. Dressed in black uniforms marked with Valen's insignia, they moved with precision, blocking any escape routes. "Princess Lysera," one of the men sneered, stepping forward. "You're coming with us." Kale instinctively stepped in front of her, his stance protective. "Over my dead body." The man chuckled darkly. "That can be arranged." Before anyone could react, Lysera grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it at the nearest attacker, catching him off guard. Her actions shocked even herself. She had never fought before, yet something inside her refused to back down. "Run," she shouted to Kale, but he ignored her, instead grabbing a piece of debris and joining the fray. Together, they managed to fend off the first wave of attackers, but more were closing in. Realizing they couldn't win this fight alone, Kale grabbed Lysera's hand and pulled her into a hidden passageway behind a stack of crates. They ran through twisting tunnels, their footsteps echoing against the damp walls, until they emerged in a deserted market square. Breathing heavily, Lysera turned to Kale, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Who were they? Why do they want me? Kale clenched his jaw, his expression grim. "This isn't random. Someone high up is trying to take you out, and blame Earth for it." Lysera's mind raced. She thought of the council meetings, the subtle resistance she'd faced from certain nobles whenever she proposed reforms. It all made sense now. Someone in her own court wanted her gone. "We need allies," Kale said firmly. "People we can trust." Lysera hesitated, then nodded. For once, she didn't argue or insist on doing things her way. Instead, she followed Kale as he led her deeper into the slums, seeking refuge among those she had once dismissed. As they disappeared into the shadows, Lysera realized something important. Survival wasn't about status or power. It was about trust. And for the first time, she trusted someone other than herself. Unbeknownst to them, their escape marked the beginning of a larger battle, one that would test not only their courage, but also their loyalty to each other and the ideals they both began to believe in. The next morning, Lysera entered the council chamber with her usual air of superiority, but her mind was elsewhere. Cal's words from their last meeting echoed in her thoughts like an unwelcome guest. "Your arrogance blinds you." She clenched her fists briefly before smoothing her expression into its typical mask of indifference. No human was going to shake her confidence. Not today, not ever. Yet, as soon as Cal walked into the room, she felt her resolve waver. He moved with ease, his plain clothes and unpolished boots a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. His dark eyes scanned the room, lingering on her for just a moment before he took his seat. There was no fear in his gaze, only calm determination. The meeting began, and once again, Cal refused to let Lysara dominate. When she dismissed Earth's latest proposal with a wave of her hand, calling it inefficient, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Inefficient, or inconvenient for you? Lysara raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. Are you questioning my judgment, human? I'm pointing out that dismissing something without understanding it is a poor way to lead. Cal replied smoothly. But then again, maybe that's why Zalora hasn't expanded its alliances in decades. A murmur spread through the chamber. Some Valith counselors exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded approvingly at Cal's boldness. Lysara's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. This human was testing her patience and winning points with her own people in the process. As the days passed, their verbal sparring became a regular feature of every meeting. Cal countered her icy remarks with sharp wit, turning her insults back on her. Once, when she accused humans of being reckless, he shot back. Funny coming from someone whose idea of diplomacy is throwing tantrums. The room erupted in stifled laughter, leaving Lysara red-faced and fuming. Despite her frustration, she couldn't help but notice how others reacted to Cal. Her own counselors seemed more engaged during discussions now, even daring to voice opinions they'd previously kept silent. For the first time, Lysara felt her authority slipping, not because of rebellion, but because Cal was making them think. One evening, after yet another heated exchange, Lysara cornered Cal outside the council chamber. Why do you insist on challenging me at every turn? She demanded, her voice low but laced with irritation. Cal crossed his arms, unfazed by her glare. Because someone has to. You act like you're better than everyone else, but all I see is someone too scared to admit she doesn't know everything. Her breath hitched, scared. She wasn't scared, she was perfect. But his words struck a nerve deep within her. Was she really afraid? Afraid of being wrong, of failing? Before she could respond, Cal continued, Here's a challenge for you, princess. Spend 1 week without using your powers or status to get what you want. If you can survive that, I'll admit you're not just some spoiled royal who thinks she's above everyone else. Lysara bristled at the insult, but beneath her anger, a flicker of curiosity stirred. Could she do it? More importantly, did she want to prove him wrong badly enough to try? Fine, she snapped, lifting her chin defiantly. I accept your challenge, but don't expect me to go easy on you. Cal grinned, clearly pleased with himself. Wouldn't dream of it, Your Highness. What neither of them realized was that this simple wager would set off a chain of events neither could have predicted. As Lysara prepared to step outside her gilded cage, she had no idea how much her world, and her perspective, was about to change.